it's been a few days since the interview. I wanted to take some time to see the patches that would roll out and all the things that Mark and Jonathan would fix that was talked about. And so far, I have to say I'm fairly pleased with quite a few things that they've done. They've rolled out fix after fix, patch after patch, adding new things, changing things, and genuinely just trying to make things better for the player. There are a few things that were unanswered or I didn't like the answer to in the interview, and I'll try to go over them briefly, but I wanted to take a few days just to get a rather measured approach and kind of think through how my feelings were over the interview, especially after my last video, which generated plenty of comments. A lot of comments from people saying that I was putting to words the feelings they were having that they couldn't really get out without thousands of expletives or a lot of anger. And I do understand that. I realize why people are angry, and I realize why there's so much vitriol flying around. Though I do think it's important to understand that the developers are just human, especially Jonathan, and that's something I'm going to bring up several times when talking about this. My overall impression of the interview is, as Jonathan admits at the end, he woke up kind of on the wrong side of the bed, which a lot of that probably has to do with the online reception that the game has been receiving and the extreme anger and hatred that's been directed towards him and his development team. Not only what he probably felt from the higher-ups, but also from his own team and on the internet. The internet is a violent and horrible place sometimes, with things that people will say to you behind a keyboard and behind a computer being absolutely abhorrent. I understand that. I've been on the internet since I was a child. I'm very well aware of the things people will say. In fact, I can't really think of things that people haven't said to me at this point. And yes, I understand. Jonathan's a professional. He's leading the company now. He should probably have a stronger spine, stronger stomach, but he's still human at the end of the day. When something you pour your heart, your blood, your soul into, like this game, the way he has been doing, and the vision that he has for it, you can't really blame him for being a little bit on the defensive when it comes to these things. Yes, obviously I would have handled things differently, and the many interruptions that happened were a little uncomfortable.
And
the thing I would say about that,
I would like to finish.
But the reality is, he's just a person at the end of the day. Holding him to a higher standard, sure, we should be doing that. But also, we still have to hold him to a basic human standard, understanding that mistakes and bad attitudes are a possibility. So let's dive into some of the things they talked about in this interview, and I'll try to remember all the things that have already been fixed. I will say one thing, that if all of these things that have been fixed so far were present when this patch came out, I might still be playing it. Though I'm very, very hyped for Last Epoch, and that's where all of my focus currently is. I might have played Path of Exile 2 for the entire weekend and possibly a bit of the week. A lot of these changes change the game for the better, and hopefully that continues. So let me touch on some key points of the interview. There's some things that people kind of skimmed over when they're talking about Jonathan's responses. One thing I'd like to add on about Jonathan is he's not great at explaining himself or his points. Some of the biggest takeaways I have from the interview are that Jonathan definitely is playing the game in a very different way than the majority of your hardcore fan base, as well as the majority of the fan base in general. I understand his confusion, frustration, and desire to explain to us why the things we're doing aren't working because he's not playing the game the same way we are, so he's not seeing the struggles we are. We joke a lot about vision, but the fact is, that is the vision that he had. However, hope is not lost, and we're not just locked into a prison of playing the game that he wants. Very quickly into their interview, the first thing Jonathan says is if people are unhappy, we will keep improving things until they are not unhappy anymore. They want smooth progression where you feel more powerful as you go through the game, and they will improve that until it is perfect. Perfect may be a bit of an outlier there, but you get what I'm saying. He definitely has passion for the game, and he wants people to have fun. And yes, while he's trying to fit that into a certain type of game that he's created, or the vision that he has for it, there's definitely a level of flexibility and understanding that not everybody plays the game the way he does. And he's trying to alter the game to that core audience. I think at the end of the day, Jonathan just isn't fantastic at explaining his points. And that's why so many times during the interview, Mark jumped in to kind of explain these things better and admit that they're working on them and want to see a change. Jonathan was admittedly a little bit defensive, especially through the first hour of the interview, constantly shooting down points as this was bringing up about issues because he doesn't have the same exact experience. This is a very common human thing to do. We can't really fault him for it, but, I understand why we're holding him at such a high standard. If you go to your average person and you tell them, hey, this thing is red or blue, and their experience has always been red, they're going to say, well, it's always been red. What are you talking about? Yes, you should always view both sides. Yes, you should look at other people's viewpoints, and your experience isn't the only experience in the world. I'm a big believer in that, and I try to practice that as much as possible. However, it is the most human thing in the world to go by our own lived experiences and not what other people are saying. And I fully understand why they're taking such a long-form, measured approach to making any of these changes and didn't immediately go in and start buffing everything. Because when you're two developers of a very large game like this, and people are coming at you from all sides of the internet with millions of different voices with different opinions saying different things are wrong, it's hard to pinpoint which ones are real. That's why this interview was such a success. That's why this was such a good thing to happen and why Zizaran is an absolute king for doing this. Because Zizaran knows what's wrong with the game in his opinion and the opinion of many other talented creators and players that love this franchise. The fact is, Zizaran went out on a limb, he didn't back down, he asked the right questions, he followed up the correct way, and he didn't let any answers that weren't satisfactory get by, and he questioned every single rebuttal that was given by Jonathan. Yes, it was uncomfortable at times, and if anyone thinks Zizaran was being rude, you're crazy. He was being extremely cordial. If anything, Jonathan was being rude, which he did apologize for. So I don't understand why you're defending this man so hard when he himself admitted he was being kind of a dick. And that takes a lot of character, it takes a lot of spine, and a lot of growth to sit there and be like, hey, I was being a dick. I'm sorry. And that's what he did. We've all been in that situation. You know you have. You've sat there and you've had an interaction with somebody and a few minutes later you've been like, man, I was kind of being an ass. You shouldn't just apologize for it. You should also really take stock of why you acted like that and try to avoid doing it in the future. And hopefully Jonathan does that. He seems like he will. He seems relatively mature, especially to admit that the way he did. And as developers of this company, they could have just shut down this interview and said nothing's wrong, but that's not what they wanted to do. They're very transparent and they're trying. They're trying because they want this game to be a success and fun for everyone. You could say that's just about money or just about pressure from Tencent or whatever inside GGG, but I don't know. To me, they still seem like the passionate developers that I fell in love with. But let's talk about a few points that were brought up that I want to go over. One of the questions that was asked was, what is the amount of time you think the campaign should take on average? And Jonathan's answer was very fair. He said that that's really hard to quantify, and that's true. The game is relatively new, the builds are relatively new, we're changing things every patch and almost every day. There's too many variables on classes, and the game hasn't been played through to completion for over 10 years like Path of Exile 1. It's hard to say, well, the campaign should take X amount of hours because everyone's going to have a different experience, and we don't have crazy highlighted speedruns over and over and over, especially when the layout is changing between seasons for some reason. The one thing he did say, however, when talking about the time the campaign should take, is he thinks that people's focus on that is because the campaign isn't fun. Here's the problem with that statement. It doesn't matter how fun the campaign is. The campaign was actually really fun the first time I did it. However, how fun the campaign is doesn't matter on a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh playthrough, and so on. When you launch a new season, there's a huge FOMO and everyone wants to get to endgame. Why does everyone want to get to endgame? Because that's where all the loot is, that's where all the currency is, that's where all the farming strategy is, and that's where all the new seasonal stuff usually starts. Tell me honestly, Path of Exile 1 players, how much do you actually engage with a new season mechanic unless it's extremely lucrative and rewarding on your way up to maps in PoE1? I'm going to bet for most of you, outside of Settlers, you don't. You probably engage with it once or twice, and unless it's about to spit out a tabula, you probably ditch that thing. You don't touch it, why would you? It's more rewarding at endgame, and that's where the game starts. And that's the point. The game starts at endgame for most people, for a lot of people. I'm sure the campaign is a long, grueling slog for a lot of people with less hours to play, who like more engaging combat, slower, methodical gameplay, and the things Jonathan seems to be tuning the game around for his own enjoyment. However, the fact is, for the majority of players of ARPGs, endgame is where everything starts. It's where all the good stuff is. The campaign being fun is irrelevant at that point, because no matter how fun the campaign is, it's not the most rewarding thing in the game, and it's not where you're going to spend the majority of your time. It's a weird disconnect because their philosophy going into early access was to rush out an endgame because they knew that's where people would spend huge chunks of their time. Yet here they are, met with people saying, I want to get to the endgame faster than you've allowed me, and saying that, well, the campaign needs to be fun so you don't feel like that. People will feel like that no matter what. It could be the best ARPG campaign ever created. It wouldn't mean I don't want to get to goddamn maps in 10 minutes. Because that's where my divines are, dude. There's some other interesting things that were hidden in the section, like how if people aren't having fun with their build, that's a problem and they'll fix it. It speaks a lot to the fact that they want to try to make as many things viable as possible, especially in the state that everything kind of got nerfed. They expressed that their goal was not to nerf the campaign, but to nerf the endgame and bring down ridiculous overpowered builds. This obviously had side effects on the campaign itself and why everybody feels everything is so nerfed, and Mark admits that they ran out of time. I don't know why they pushed the date out while running out of time. I don't think a lot of the conspiracy theories are fully correct. Some people said it was to crush Last Epoch. I'm not sure how much I believe that. Maybe there was someone else who had that decision above them, or maybe it was just very poor timing. I'm not going to speculate heavily on that. I can still say I'm not happy with that decision, and I don't like it. However, it did give Last Epoch more time to cook and more time to build up publicity, which I'm going to be logging in on that and having a lot of good times. The fact is, though, they seem to have ran out of time, as Mark admitted. They nerfed all the endgame top-end stuff, and then when it came to the middle range and low-end stuff, they didn't have time to buff it. So now all these patches we're subsequently seeing coming out, they're buffing a lot of that stuff to try to compensate because we all just feel weaker and like we're having less fun. He admits that they're firing from the hip with a lot of things in early access, which is not the greatest thing to hear, but kind of makes sense given it's early access. As much as I love Mark, that wasn't a great statement to make because it tells me you're kind of throwing shit at the wall and hoping that it sticks, and the rest of us are just kind of waiting to catch it as it falls. One thing Jonathan does bring up at one point in the interview is talking about the experience of players. I'm going to talk a lot about humanity here, as I know a lot about it, even though I'm a cat. The fact is, a very human thing to do is focus more on a negative experience than a positive experience, and that's what a lot of people are going to do. What Jonathan said is the problem is they are fixing things behind the players that are complaining. So if Act 1 and 2 were a problem for you, well, they've fixed it, but you're already in Act 3, so you're not going to experience those. If the entire campaign was a problem, they've already fixed as much as they can with lowering mob health, lowering speed, fixing some of the more swarmy areas, and lowering the areas in Act 3 that were a pain in the ass. Well, you're not doing those areas anymore, so it doesn't affect you, but you still have that bitter taste in your mouth from having to gruelingly slog through that through the campaign. It's not going to make it better for you, and it's going to leave you kind of embittered with them until you go level a new character, which may not be until the next league, or may not be at all this league. Understandably so. It was a huge miss for them to launch the patch in this state, and I spent multiple days asking myself if we even got the right version when I saw some of the bugs that were coming out, which we'll get to later. I think it's important to understand that a lot of people are going to have negative feelings about that and react in a negative way, and there's nothing we can do about it. One thing I want to talk about in detail that Jonathan said that I kind of don't agree with, and even though I came out of this interview with a little bit more faith in him, when we had the whole discussion about movement speed, this came up twice, and Jonathan is very heavily thinking that the player cannot be faster than the monster, or that the player cannot always be faster than the monster. He thinks that if the monsters are slower than the player, combat becomes optional, and players are going to run away and avoid them. Ziz brings up a very good counter-argument to this, saying that that's where all the loot, that's where all the EXP is. If you spent your whole time running away from these monsters and you got to a mandatory boss, you're going to die to that boss because you have no gear and no damage, and no health, and no levels. You have nothing. But here's the thing. We make a lot of comparisons to the campaign of Path of Exile 2 and the playstyle that Jonathan seems to be going for to the Souls series. I'm going to reference the Souls series here, but this is true for all video games. Running away is a valid strategy. Running and avoiding things is a valid strategy. Getting some distance to catch your breath or do something is a valid strategy. It's the Joestar family special. How can you not allow running away? And yes, it should not be possible in every single situation, but when I was playing the game, it was basically not possible in the majority of situations. Especially if you're playing any amount of combo builds. I was playing ED Contagion, trying to get off both of those abilities on the correct target, mind you, because they hit one target unless you do Chain and Unleash. I would constantly get swarmed, body blocked, pinned into a corner, and then overwhelmed. The fact is, running away is a viable strategy, and yes, speedruns should be allowed to avoid monsters. Looking at the Souls series, you can literally run away from monsters. You can run to heal up, you can run to get away, you can run past them. Pretty much every video game outside of a few allow you to do something along those lines. Running is a strategy. It should be alright to do. And as is said, we don't always want to run because we need loot and EXP to conquer the rest of the game. There is no problem with the monsters being slower than the players. I don't understand the concept that it needs to be this constant challenge where you can't get away from them and they're always on top of you. Though I will say they've made sweeping changes to this, the mentality of it still concerned me a little for future updates. They nerfed the wolves, they nerfed the Faradin, they nerfed a lot of the swarmy areas, and Mark was very adamant about not wanting the game to feel like that in multiple ways. So, from what I've seen in the patches that they've released, that looks like it's getting solved here and there. And if I went and played through the campaign again, I'd probably have a much better experience as a caster. It's also a bit odd that Jonathan seems to be digging his feet into the dirt and the concept that even just the wolves in Act 1 in the second zone should be overwhelming and swarming and challenging, because otherwise you'll be cheating the player out of a challenging experience and set them up for failure by making the game seem too easy. I personally don't remember enemies in most games, especially that early, being that difficult or that swarmy or fast. Speed is a big thing in video games, especially on enemies. When you're playing a game where avoidance is an option, them being too fast becomes a huge problem, and when you don't have any tools to deal with that, especially at like level 2, you're gonna start having problems. Obviously you'd be higher level before getting to that zone, but you get what I'm saying. There's no sense of trivializing that game just because those monsters aren't that fast, and because right out the gate you're not getting slammed. Another concerning thing that Jonathan said that is very confusing, in line with the whole running away process, is he said he doesn't like the knowledge gap between players to be extreme and to allow large elements of power. I was very confused by this. He seemed to be referencing, well, if you know to take this node, you're going to have much better time than someone that doesn't. And, well, that's the basis of video games. Knowledge is power. That's the basis of life. The more you know about a thing, the more powerful you'll be doing it, or the better you'll do it. I understand that he doesn't want the knowledge gap to be so large that you run into a Path of Exile 1 situation where a new player comes in, looks at the passive tree, and uninstalls the game, or comes in and just can barely struggle through the campaign while a knowledge player is getting through it in 2 to 4 hours like a beast. There's definitely a fine line to be drawn there, but I don't think just not allowing huge power spikes from knowledge is a good idea. Even the Soul series has items you can run off into the open world and grab immediately to make your playthrough much better, and knowledgeable players will find ways to do things no matter what that make them faster and stronger than people who don't know what's happening. The good thing about that is the human knowledge transfer and tribal knowledge, where we can just teach people things and make YouTube videos, make tutorials, or just tell our friends, hey, if you do this, good things will happen. That's part of an organic video game culture, and it's what makes these things great, is because we can all communicate and share ideas and strategies with each other to make them fun. I don't like the answer that maybe nothing should be that powerful if you know about it, just so new players aren't experiencing some kind of FOMO where other people are blasting ahead of them, because then your players who don't have a high skill ceiling get bored. Luckily, once again, this is something they seem to be working on, so I have good confidence that we're not going to experience this in the next league. A funny comment that was made by Ziz at one point is when he said he believes there's 2 player bases for this game. He referenced the people who want to blast and have challenging bosses, and the ones that want the every second moment-to-moment engaging gameplay. Jonathan stated he finds this as less binary. What he doesn't realize is Ziz is literally talking to him and Mark, because I view Mark as the player who wants to blast, and I view Jonathan as the player who wants engaging moment-to-moment combat. Ziz is literally talking about the 2 people in front of them, and we just get onto a conversation of how there's not so much of a binary in those 2 players. I do think what Jonathan's saying has merit. I think there's a crossover between those players. I thought the campaign was really fun. I absolutely loved the Act 1 boss. I thought his theme and his lines were amazing. The Act 2 boss, I freaked out when he cut the platform in half and the fight transitioned. And Oriani was really cool with a lot of neat animations. He didn't really have the same oomph as the other 2, but he was still really cool. A lot of the stuff in those acts was great outside of how crazily large the maps were and how long they took me to get through because I didn't know what I was doing. There's a lot of things that Jonathan didn't fully grasp the point of, and even came off as a little dismissive. Things like the Regal Shard situation with loot, them going far as saying that for this boss or this you can swap to this piece of gear, to which my response is, what piece of gear? I don't have extra gear because every extra piece of gear I get either gets vendored or disenchanted. I'm not saving multiple rares for different situations because I can't afford to because my gear sucks. That, or I'm using items I bought from a vendor 3 acts ago that there's no upgrades to. Jonathan seems to think there's no problem with the loot, and I'm actually kind of on this conspiracy theory train with Zizaran and everyone else that we're getting less loot in Act 2 and 3 than we do in Act 1. I remember helping multiple people with the Act 2 boss because I was able to kill it and they weren't while they were playing Huntress, and one of their problems was they would spend over an hour just trying to farm for a rare that they could put into 1/10 of a Regal Shard so they could try to maybe possibly get a good item, because it's all a damn gamble. There's definitely an issue with the loot, and I'm a little concerned about that because it has yet to be fully addressed that I've seen. One of the funnier things in this interview happens to be the fact that they talked about the "what we're working on" post. They said that people kind of jumped the gun, getting aggressive with them and mad that that's all they were working on, and they said, well, this is what we're just working on today, why are people mad? I think there's a big disconnect in communication there, which is a common theme for Jonathan a little bit through this interview, where he's just not communicating correctly or understanding different perspectives. I still love him, but it's a big problem he seems to have here, probably because he's upset, justifiably so. But the fact is, those "what we're working on" posts have been historically rather infrequent, and they usually don't say, hey, what we're working on today, and then we'll work on other things tomorrow. Even just a small blurb at the end saying that's just what we're doing today, we'll see more stuff tomorrow, would have helped massively with communication and not made people feel like that the solution was more checkpoints. Because let's be real, that's what that post said. The post said we're giving you more checkpoints, and that there's not enough to do in the maps. It was a bad look. There's a reason people were mad and assumed it's all you cared about, because we had gotten nothing but dismissive answers since that point. Let's talk a bit about the things in this conversation that I was a little confused about and wasn't so happy about. Let me set the record straight though. I do like a lot of where these conversations went. I like that these things are now in Jonathan and Mark's heads, and they're actually going to address them and have been addressing them. Things like adding runes to caster weapons to give a little more oomph there, trying to add things like artificer orbs to quests to make sure people can actually progress better. There's a lot of things they've been adding and really thinking about, and this interview gave them a lot to chew on. It speaks volumes about what happens when the problems are highlighted for them by a knowledgeable, talented player like Zizaran. Because he brought all things to them in a clear, concise, and calm manner, they were able to examine it and have multiple discussions about it and realize, hey, we want to change that. I would have talked in detail about how I feel about their reluctancy to do respecs and ascendancy respecs, but hey, literally the night before I was going to make this video, ascendancy respecs are now on the table and coming with a new patch. A great decision that surprisingly was held up by Mark, which I didn't realize until the interview and was very confused by, considering he's so open to a lot of these changes. I'm glad ascendancy respecs are on the table because they're sorely needed, especially because he brought up the fact that Blood Mage and Sheila have like a 0.1% play rate and are in just a terrible state right now and need a lot of love. A great acknowledgement because I hope those classes do get some love. I love the theme of Blood Mage, I just hate playing it. So talking a bit about the things that they brought up, there's things like the keystones and potentials of masteries, which are interesting, though they don't want to make the notables themselves boring by adding keystone masteries. I understand that, but keystones are fun. Though they did admit that the downsides of them feel a little bad or a little too frequent, especially in the warrior area of the tree. My problem with this is something that wasn't really talked about is the downsides of ascendancies. One of my major problems is that so many ascendancies have downsides. Ascendancies are supposed to be part of the class power fantasy. They're supposed to lead you to a different path and do a lot of fun things, but the downsides are really apparent. And yes, there's definitely that thing of you want to feel the node or you want to feel what you're selecting, which is something Jonathan talks about a lot when he was talking about things like more damage for negative attack speed. But ascendancies you're always going to feel, or you should, and that's just a design problem if you don't. I don't think a downside to them is necessary to feel that as much. I think the Blood Mage Ascendancy is probably the worst offender of this, especially considering it's mandatory to get to any of the other Ascendancy points, and you get it around level 25 to 30. So the reality is that question is kind of still lingering in the air, and I'm concerned about it, because I don't want Ascendancies to have massive downsides. Yes, they need to change the way you play the game a little bit here and there, and that seems to be the design philosophy of Path of Exile 2 versus Path of Exile 1, but I'm not a huge fan of the way they are right now. Maybe that's just because Blood Mage kind of burned me in the way it is, or how some of the other things work. Like the Lich's ability to spend Energy Shield to do more damage, where if you're out of Energy Shield, you can't cast spells, and it doesn't really tell you that. And it was very surprising, and I had to spend half my gold to respec. That was irritating. There's a lot of this interview, especially given that it's 2 hours long, that I go into detail talking about, but I think there's a lot of people that have already done that, and most of you have probably already seen it. That's why I don't have it playing in the background, and I'm not going to post the 2 hours of me watching it on stream and just commenting on it, especially because it was at like 2 in the morning and I got really tired. But there are some things that I want to talk about. First off, let's talk about my feelings after exiting this interview. Well, I definitely love Zizaran more than I thought I could. He came to this interview packing, ready to fight. But obviously, he was respectful. The only thing that was disrespectful was the times when he was repeatedly interrupted, and thus he started interrupting in turn because it felt like two people trying to go off on a train of thought. And that makes sense, they all both have a lot of thoughts in their head. He followed up on the questions amazingly. They were detailed, they were well thought out and well put, and they really affected the conversation about the future of the game. I can't properly express the amount of respect I gained for Zizaran, though it was already very high. I've watched his content since I first started playing Path of Exile, and he's a big reason I was able to get into the game as a relatively dumb animal that doesn't know how things work. His videos have always been insightful and helpful, and his stream has always been a fun place to hang out. The fact that he took the lead on such an important interview to basically help make the game better for everyone is a huge step up, and pretty much exactly what I expect from someone like him. As for Jonathan and Mark, in my last video I was relatively critical, though I never said I held any hate in my heart, because I really don't hate them. I don't even dislike them. I just had a lot of respect for them that was tarnished and lost, especially with the way the game launched in its current state. I was hurt, and I felt betrayed because these are people that I trusted with a game series that I loved and something I'd been looking forward to for 5 years, and that last year of anticipation had been gnawing at me, near constantly. The fact is, this interview did help a little. It alleviated some concerns I had about where their mental state is and answered a couple questions that I had lingering around. Jonathan, I think after this interview, is in a much better place and understands a bit that his perspective isn't the only one. My biggest takeaways were the fact that not only did he apologize for being standoffish and rude and admit that it was a problem for him, but he also straight up admitted in the interview that maybe he needs to play the game in a different way to see some of this perspective he's not understanding. This could solve a lot of things if he really approaches it from the different viewpoint of someone else, which is what you should be doing and something that he may not have had the time to do or the perspective in front of him that he needs to do. Mark was obviously amazing here, jumping in to answer things, especially when Jonathan wasn't explaining them too well. And that was a common theme. Jonathan definitely has ideas and concepts that he wants to get across, but the way he explains them is not good. And given that he was frustrated and probably had a very long week with high pressure from everyone around him, it's understandable he had trouble articulating his thoughts properly or in a satisfactory way for all of us, including Zizaran. Mark jumping in helped massively, and Mark was very willing to say, hey, this is something we're looking into. The overall message I got from the interview is, hey, we're going to look into these things and we're going to do what we can. It's great, and it's real. It wasn't fake, it wasn't fluff PR talk. They're doing it. There's patches that are coming out. They're fixing all the things they talked about. They're looking into the things they talked about. They're posting about it. There's not much more I can ask for in that sense. Well, there are some things that I still have issue with, because it wouldn't be a video about Path of Exile 2 unless a little cat on your screen was bitching. Let's talk about unanswered questions. The whole Regal solution, as well as the loot, never really got an answer. I haven't looked at all the patch notes and details, but I didn't see anything major that's going to solve the problem that Zizaran was explaining about his gear. Yes, as Jonathan said, and I do agree, gear problem is a monster power problem. But the gear is the satisfying part. I don't just want you to nerf the monsters so that my shitty gear lets me get through the game. I want to keep getting better gear and upgrading it and having fun acquiring loot, as that's a core aspect of ARPGs, especially progression through the low levels to the high levels. A big problem with the game that I've noticed on multiple playthroughs is half the time, especially as a caster, I'll buy a +2 or +3 wand from a vendor in Cruel, and then I won't replace it until tier 15 maps, or if I buy something from somebody for cheap. Especially early on in a league, those things are going to be extremely expensive, so I'm just going to keep using the +2, +3 wand or offhand. These kind of things make upgrading loot a little difficult because you're not going to replace that item unless you find one with the same plus skill or another, and then you get to do the slot machine pull of slamming currency on it and hoping that you get something better. Most of the time you won't. The reality is there definitely needs to be some sort of investigation into how the loot is progressing and how it works. The way Jonathan explains he plays and how he has plenty of regals is not my experience, and I don't think it's the experience of many people unless you are literally killing everything that you find and going through every single part of those maps very carefully and slowly, looting almost every item. Though I still don't understand how he's getting so many regals, because I feel like once I got to Act 2, rares just stopped dropping for the most part. I feel like I maybe got 6 to 10 rares the entire act, and I definitely wasn't going that fast. I was dying. I reset zones on accident because I died. I even went through the end of Act 2 3 times helping other people and got very few rares from it outside of the boss kill. But I could be an outlier, Ziz could be an outlier, it could all be outliers, but they have the ability to track that, and maybe we'll see a post about it in the future. Maybe we're all just biased and a little angry. The other thing I'm still a little concerned about is map size. Jonathan did express that he agrees that it is frustrating to go down a dead end. I just hope that that doesn't mean there will be still dead ends, but now there's some stupid mechanic at the end that I can engage with. Like I said earlier, most people just want to reach the end game, and if you're going to be changing the entire layouts of all the maps between leagues like they did between the last one and this one, you can't really go with the excuse that people will learn the layouts and understand them, or that they're pointing you where to go, because a lot of those mechanics are not obvious. The map sizes still feel too big to me, and the dead ends are still too numerous. What I'm hoping is that they just change this overwhelmingly and stop creating situations that feel like they're meant to trap us. I understand that a lot of these pathways and a lot of these things have rewards, and there's several things in Act 1 where when you go off the beaten path, you find something new and exciting. Problem is that when you're playing a second character, or you're just going through the campaign trying to get to endgame, a lot of those rewards aren't useful. I can only have so many level 1 support gems before I just don't need them anymore, considering they also drop from monsters. And maybe that's why rares feel so different in the acts, because Act 1 has so much little side content, and Act 2 and 3 really don't feel like they have nearly as much that's easily accessible without a long trek out of your way that's annoying. There are some other little small concerns I have just about the pacing of the game and other things, but it does seem they're open to addressing them, so I won't comment on them too heavily. Now, one thing I want to talk about is early access. And talking about early access, I'm also going to bring up some comments I got on my previous video. And we're going to talk a bit about toxic positivity and how it negatively affects video games. So when we talk about toxic positivity, let's talk about the fact that if this interview hadn't happened, a lot of these things might not be getting fixed as quickly, or even the conversation might not be happening at all. When you go up with these developers in an interview, or you talk to them directly, and you constantly praise the game or are unwilling to criticize their decisions or question why they're happening, you're only going to receive a worse product. You can't claim that everything needs to be hunky-dory and happy, and you can't just constantly deflect these things. If you do, you're going to have a worse product for everybody. No, I don't support any of the toxicity that's been aimed at Jonathan and Mark, and I think part of Jonathan's frustration is because of how much of that there was. But you can't just tell him that everything's all right. Ziz did a great job of being respectful and calling out the problems, and when Jonathan responded in a way that wasn't satisfactory, he doubled down and found ways around those questions and answers. He demanded a real answer and demanded that we know why these things are happening, and I think we did get some really good answers, even if not directly through just the perspective we're seeing. Being overly positive about a product that you've paid for, even when it's not good, just because you love it, isn't a good way for that product to become better. Your love and your passion for something should also drive your criticism for it. It should also drive your desire to see something better come of it. Let me just say this. If there's 100 people in the room and 99 of them are freaking out and you're standing there shrugging your shoulders, you're probably just not paying attention, or you're just ignorant. Because you know what's going to happen. Eventually the water filling the room is going to hit your ankles too, and then you can't shrug anymore. You have to understand that people were outcrying for this for a reason. And like I said in my last video, it comes from love and passion for wanting this to be the best ARPG on the market. So don't pretend that it's perfect, and don't pretend that nothing's wrong, or that people are crazy for thinking that. Toxic positivity does not help anybody, especially not us as the players. And it definitely doesn't help the developers, because they want to make a good game too, and we need to tell them what we think is good. Because at the end of the day, maybe they're making a product for themselves, but they're not the ones who are going to be paying for all of it. It's going to be all of us. And people these days will vote with their wallet more often than not. The other thing I want to talk about is early access and some of the comments I've received. First off, a lot of the comments I received in my video were overwhelmingly positive. Everyone was saying how I put to words what they were thinking and feeling, and I can't be more grateful that you guys took the time to leave positive comments agreeing with me and being happy. I will say some of you had some pretty colorful language involving Jonathan and Mark and Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. I don't necessarily agree with all of you, but I understand where your frustration's coming from. I don't think the game is bad. Shocker, I know, and I'm sorry if I lost some of you by saying that, but I don't think the game is bad. I just don't think it's in an amazing state right now. However, I do think it's in a significantly better state today than it was last week when it launched 0.20. And that's largely due to these conversations that have been happening. There were some funny comments though. Someone said the game might not be for me, which, you know, I hope you read the title, because that's what the title said. And some people just said that I'm bad at video games, which, yeah, I said that. Though I have 500 hours in this game and I farmed multiple mirrors in the first early access season, so I was doing fine. It's not about being good or bad at the game, it's about how the game feels to me. If it doesn't feel fun, why would I play? But the other thing I want to bring up is people saying, well, this is just early access. And there's a lot of information to unpack there when we try to cope and say it's just early access. And let me be clear, it is cope. Yes, it's early access. Yes, things are going to change, things are going to get bad sometimes, things are going to be good sometimes. That doesn't mean we lose the right to complain. And yes, there's a difference between giving measured complaints and criticisms and freaking the hell out and losing your mind, but at least make it funny, at least make it enjoyable, make some fun content about it like other people have. The reality is, early access is not a free pass for them to just do things that make the entire player base unhappy, or at least 80-70% of the player base. Majority is going to rule here. If you make this game slow down and methodical, not everyone's going to enjoy that, and if not everyone includes 70% of your player base, you're going to have to change that. The fact is, early access isn't an okay argument as for why the game is the way it is. The whole point of early access is so we can give this feedback and make it better, and so that they can test it out and get it in multiple players' hands to see thousands and thousands of perspectives. And speaking of early access, let's talk about something else I'm very unhappy about. Because if you're going to say this game is early access and not to worry about it, I want you to know that goes both ways. Let's talk about the ritual tablet problem. Let's talk about the fact that GGG put into the game a tablet, a unique ritual tablet that allowed you to reroll favor on ritual infinite numbers of times. This could then be stacked with other tablets for ritual that let you lower the cost of deferring an item. Well, what did this result in? It resulted in people infinitely rolling rituals and deferring dozens of great items like Audience with the King, Mirrors of Kalandra, Divine Orbs. I'm sure it's not as widespread as a lot of people made it out to be, but people did this. People did this very consistently. They did it to generate a lot of these items. The problem is, and this will be a controversial take, they were banned for it. Now, if we're going off the rule that this is early access and you shouldn't be upset about things, why are we banning people for using a mechanic the way it was put into the game? That tablet was put into the game like that. The other tablets were also put into the game like that. This wasn't some crazy exploit. We weren't duping temporalysis. Granted, it was generating an insane amount of currency that would probably have bricked the economy if left unchecked, but it was put into the game like that. It wasn't some unforeseen bug. It wasn't somebody resetting zones to kill the end boss of Sanctum over and over for temporalis drops. It wasn't something obviously bugged, it was just very clearly not well tested or documented. Yes, if you see that, you should probably realize that it's not the intended interaction there, and it might be a bit too much or a bit too powerful. Now, the question is, how many people would do this upon realizing this mechanic exists? I'm going to say quite a few. I'm sure there were plenty that looked at it and said, I'm not touching that because that doesn't seem intended. But what is and isn't intended is a very murky place to get into when you're in an early access, or just in this game's current state in general, because why are we allowing the things that aren't intended to only hurt us but not help us? Do I think that people should have been banned for it? No, not really. Maybe the extremely egregious cases are outliers, but I would have rather seen their currency just deleted from the market or these items generated deleted. And I know that's an overwhelming task, possibly one that isn't even doable. But banning people for it seems kinda crazy. Yes, you could consider this an exploit. Yes, you consider it using broken game mechanics, but come on. Historically, a lot of the bans for these things have been very clear exploits, and these guys were just doing exactly what the items said on them. They weren't getting around some mechanic, they weren't exploiting server lag, they weren't exploiting broken things. Well, in a sense, it wasn't broken. But the items just did what they said they did on them. The tablet just did what it said, and you could combine it with other tablets that just did what they said. It just doesn't seem fair to blanket ban 300 plus people for something like this, because most people would see this, especially people not familiar with what kind of bugs might get them banned, and would just do it. If I was a new player who managed to get to endgame and I saw this strategy and was like, oh, that's awesome, and I started using it and got banned, I would be livid for understandable reasons. Now, if you're going to sit here and cope about the fact that this game is early access, you also need to allow things like this to happen. Should we have left it unchecked? No, it definitely should have been fixed and we should have deleted the currency. Banning is still a little bit higher of a punishment than I think was necessary for something like this, because really at the end of the day, this is GGG's fault for lack of testing. And like I said, why are we being only punished for unintended actions? Granted, yes, there's bugged interactions that help us kill things faster, like the Huntress tornado attack, but this is still a little bit of a gray murky area. I'm not 100% sure on how I feel about it, but it leaves a bad taste in my mouth seeing them just straight up ban players for a literal intended action of these items as how they were written. Now, if there was some kind of bug exploitation there behind it that I'm not aware of, then sure, I can agree with it, but it just seems a little silly and a little off message. When we even have people like Mark saying, yeah, it's early access, so we're afforded a little bit of this and that. You should probably afford the players some of that too. And beyond that, there's still a few other problems that I have. I'm still not happy about them targeting the Last Epoch date, though I don't know the reasoning behind it, so I can't comment deeply. It was still something that left a sour taste in my mouth. I still don't like the fact that their testers have gone on record telling me that they reported all of these issues and they weren't fixed, but now that Mark said they kind of ran out of time, I can understand why, but there's still something to be said about launching a game that you know people won't enjoy and then getting upset that they don't enjoy it and not understanding why when your testers told you exactly why. There's also the fact that we don't have a clear answer on if the Act 1 and Act 2 maps will be made any smaller with less dead ends. There's still no answer to the Regal Orb problem or the gear progression problem, though all of these things could be solved relatively shortly, and I do have a lot of hope that they will be. So far, coming out of this interview, I've just felt better. Better about the future of Path of Exile 2, better about Mark and Jonathan, I may low-key have a crush on Zizaran now, and just happy to see the game going in a good direction. Will I play it anytime soon? Maybe I'll play a little bit of it for fun, but Last Epoch's on the horizon and I'm way more interested in content for that right now. Though maybe if there's a gap, I'll try it out. I really wanted to play more of my 80 Contagion Lich and see how that went. Sorry for any of you jumping on the bandwagon of fully hating these two and hating Path of Exile 2, but I'm just not there, and you may have gotten the wrong message from my last video. Maybe the title was a little clickbaity, but I don't think the game's bad. In fact, it's in a better state now than it was a week ago, and that's a good thing. I only want to see this game get better, and I'm only going to support this game getting better, and if my criticism helps in any way do that, or gives voices to people who are voiceless, then that's a good thing to me. Maybe I'll make another video on it after I play it a little more after Last Epoch dies down, but we'll see. Other than that, I'll see you all in the next league. Thank you so much for watching as usual. I'm Sleepy Cat, and I'm tired. Good night.